Good evening and welcome back to our study, Believe in Me, Jesus in the Gospel of John. Today we are in John chapter 5 through 7 for Jesus' healing of the man at the pool of Bethesda. And before we get into today's lesson, let's review last week when we discussed Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well. So, was there anything that stood out to you about that lesson, or what did you find significant about Jesus' interaction with the Samaritan woman?
That Jesus is no respecter of persons, male or female, Jew or Greek. To me, that really
Yay.
stood out.
Yeah, he really he um, pursued this person for a disciple, and it didn't matter that it was a Samaritan or that it was a woman or that it was an outcast. But Jesus prioritized this interaction with the woman and also really had an intense discussion with her in order to disciple her. And he revealed himself and his messiahship to her there in Samaria in a way that he really didn't do in Jerusalem and in Judea. Yeah, great point. What else?
Just the visual and the analogy that Jesus is once again replacing like the institution of the old well with the new living water that he is.
Yeah, okay. So, I don't think we really connected the water element of the well with the living water as we talked about that, but we didn't talk it as part of the Jesus replaces the Jewish institution. So that is a great point, and it goes, I think, a little bit beyond what we talked about last week. I really love that. We talked about Jesus replacing the finding a bride at the well trope with finding disciples, establishing a church, or the bride of Christ. And we talked about Jesus replacing a historical place of worship and division, ethnic division, with worship that is focused on Jesus himself. So that replacement comes in multiple ways, including with that living water. Yeah, great point. Anything else stand out to you or that you found meaningful? I also loved how um, how radically Jesus set aside the conventions of where to worship in Jerusalem, and that division that had made between Jews and Samaritans, and how when Jesus replaced the place of worship with himself, what it did to give people, all these people groups, an opportunity to come together and to be the worshipers that God seeks. Yeah, anything else y'all want to talk about before we get into today's lesson? Well, we
I
saw
thought
that
it
John
was,
has taken. Oh, go ahead.
I thought it was really interesting how Jesus could have gone anywhere else other than Samaria because the road that he was on.
Yeah, you could have
But yet
gone
he
around, you
chose.
could have skipped it very easily, and most did. Yeah. Yeah. So we just, we take from that Jesus wanted to have this interaction and this was important. Yeah, good point. Well, John has taken us through these four Jewish institutions, right? So that Jesus himself is the new host of the messianic banquet. Jesus is the new temple where God dwells among us. Jesus is the new rabbi and teacher of Israel, and Jesus is the new center of worship for the people of God, the source of the living water that will bring eternal life. And so from that, we're moving into the next section of John. And the next section, and we did all four of those Jewish institutions. We won't do all four of the Jewish festivals, but that's how the next section is organized. And so we'll watch for that as we go along. Would someone please read John 5, 1 through 9? And if you have a footnote partway through verse 3, and the end of verse 3 and all of verse 4 is relegated to a footnote, would you read those out too? Because they give us some useful information. Aaron, you looked like you were able to read that. Is that right? Thanks.
Evan was talking to me though, so I didn't hear how far.
Oh, 1 through 9. And if you
Okay.
can pick up the 4 from the footnote, that'd be great.
Okay. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. I do not have a footnote. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be healed?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I am going, another steps down before me." Jesus said to him, "Get up, take your bed and walk." And at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed and walked. Now that day was the Sabbath. So the Jews said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath."
That's good.
Oh, that was 10. Sorry, I didn't see the number 10.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll read. So the part that is normally in a footnote, and it's in a footnote because the earliest manuscripts don't have it. So, the best translation practice would say that it's not original, but it's been added as an explanatory note, and it's helpful. So here's the part that is missing from 3, and like your version just like probably skipped over 4 because 4 is in that section that isn't usually translated or isn't put in the main translation. So in verse 3, in these lay a multitude of those who were sick, blind, lame, paralyzed, waiting for the moving of the waters. For an angel of the Lord went down at certain seasons into the pool and stirred up the water. Whoever then first, after the stirring of the water, stepped in was made well from whatever disease with which he was afflicted. Okay, so what is the scene like at Bethesda? What's going on there?
I always feel like,
man was,
oh,
go ahead.
I always have felt like it's a collection of the ill and the lame and just a collection of the worst in society.
The most in need, yeah.
Yeah. And the people, like probably the healthy people were only there if they were there to help a family member. And you didn't just go there.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's probably right because they're waiting. And the way that they understood it is that the waters would be stirred, and it was understood as by an angel, and so someone would help them down into the pool so that they could be healed. So anyone who's there is there either because it's a place where people give alms, maybe, but you would think that if they're there, it's to be healed, right? This word Bethesda, and some manuscripts do have Bethzada or Bethsaida, but the word Bethesda means house of Hesed, house of mercy, or the great covenant loyalty of God, the faithful, deep loving faithfulness of God, the Hesed of God, which is a word that we have talked about in some of our Old Testament studies. And so Bethesda is this house of mercy. Well, who does Jesus speak to in verse 5?
The invalid that had been there for 38 years.
Yeah, 38. And I had to have this pointed out to me, but 38 years would be a significant number. Stable. 38 years would be a significant number. When the Israelites wandered 40 years in the wilderness, 2 years were out at Mount Sinai, and 38 years were in the desert. And so that number might jump out to an original reader. So this man has been ill all this time. And why? And Jesus asks him, he's there, right? He's at Bethesda, the pool. And why do you think Jesus asks him, do you want to get well?
Because he could see his heart, and he knew that couldn't get in by himself, and nobody was there to help him get in the water.
I feel like this is a big
Yeah.
question.
So go ahead.
So, he's asking him, do you want to be healed? And that's life altering. After 38 years, this man has his life. He has his routine. He has his stuff. There was a woman that we used to go to church with that had, I can't remember what it was. She passed away, but she was smart and she was functional, but she had a hard time walking and talking and all this stuff. But and people would ask her if she would like to be healed, and she said no. Because if she was healed, she wouldn't be who she was. And and looking at this now, do you want to be healed? That's a really big question.
Agreed.
It is. And what kind of demands are on an able-bodied person that are not on someone who is an invalid, who is ill? And how do you pick, not to call this person lazy, but how do you pick up those demands late in life? How do you begin, are you then supposed to go be a day laborer? What are you supposed to do if you have not been a carpenter all these years, if you have not been a stonemason all these years, if you have not, how are you supposed to? It is a major change in life. So there's all the logistical issues, and then also just the, who are you if you're suddenly have this major physical difference? Yeah. And then I think Shirley has a good point too about Jesus seeing the man's heart, which we're going to notice in Jesus' later interaction with the man as well when we get to verse 15, 16. 14, when we get to verse 14. Jesus asks it maybe as an invitation, but also as is this a change that you're looking for? And we can't help noticing that the man does not say yes or no, right? He has reasons, but he doesn't answer. And Jesus goes ahead and heals him. How does Jesus heal this man? What does he do?
He told him to pick up his pallet and walk.
Yeah, it's just with his word alone. And so, we are always informed by the prologue as we go through John. And so the word has power here. And that that word get up is the word arise. And it's the same word for raise up the temple in 3 days, or when he was raised from the dead, right? Just as the Father raises the dead. All of these uses, it's the same word as Jesus tells the man, arise. And he tells him to pick up his mat and walk. Now, the text is a little dramatic here because it slips into this little bomb of information at the very end of verse 9. What is this tidbit of information that sort of changes the scene?
It's the Sabbath.
Yeah, now it was this. So it's a late reveal. over the fact that it was the Sabbath, right? John's getting dramatic on us. It's the Sabbath. So why do you think Jesus told him to carry his mat on the Sabbath? Did Jesus not know this was not allowed? What's going on there?
He's
Well,
showing the power and authority that God has over the law. Like he is challenging the what's understood to be able to happen on the Sabbath.
well, he also goes ahead and explains to them in some verses later that, hey, you guys do the circumcisions and you do that on the Sabbath because you don't want to break the law by doing it on the ninth day instead of the eighth day or whatever it is. And so I guess he's just showing that, look, you're taking this a little bit too literally. I think there's going to be some changes you're going to have to get used to.
So okay, this is great. And we're going to talk more about why Jesus mentioned circumcision when we get to that passage. So that's a great point. So definitely keep that in mind. Yes. So I heard y'all saying like Jesus is showing his authority
Mm-hmm.
to say what should and shouldn't happen, and also using his authority to challenge the religious authorities of the day. And I can't really see any way. I mean, to me, I've puzzled over this a lot. I think this has to be an intentional challenge, an intentional escalation of his conversation with
Yeah.
these religious authorities when he brings them up. And he somehow wants to make a point about their understanding of religious law versus his understanding. So let's read 10 through 19. And I'll just make a note that you'll be stopping in the middle of a paragraph, but we need 18 and 19 because they are parallel to 16 and 17. They're like a little repeat verses, 18 and 19 are. So if someone would read 10 through 19, please.
Jewish leaders said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath. The law forbids you to carry your mat." But he replied, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Pick up your mat and walk.'" So they asked him, "Who is this fellow who told you to pick it up and walk?" The man who was healed had no idea who it was, for Jesus had slipped away into the crowd that was there. Later Jesus found him at the temple and said to him, "See, you are well again. Stop sinning and something worse may happen to you." The man went away and told the Jewish leaders that it was Jesus who had made him well. So because Jesus was doing these things on the Sabbath, the Jewish leaders began to persecute him. In his defense, Jesus said to them, "My Father is always at his work to this very day, and I too am working." For this reason, they tried all the more to kill him. Not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making him equal with God. Jesus gave them this answer: "Very truly I tell you, the Son can do nothing by himself. He can do only what he sees his Father doing, because whatever the Father does, the Son also does."
Okay, thank you. All right, so let's just make a repeat note in verse 10 when it says the Jews were saying, who were the Jews? Who do we mean by the Jews? Because everybody in this story is a Jew, right? All the characters are Jewish. So who are the
Right.
Jews?
The Pharisees.
Jewish religious authorities. Yeah. The people who felt that they had the authority to police what was being done on the Sabbath, right, is what comes out here. So the Jewish religious authorities, Pharisees, etc., right? And what does the man answer?
So I don't know who it was.
Yeah, he doesn't know who it was, but he's quick to say, "It's not my fault.
Yes.
The person who made me well told me to do it."
Yep.
What do you think of that answer?
It's the old Adam saying, "Eve made me do it."
Yeah. Yeah.
I laughed at that.
One of my commentators was like very disgruntled at this man for like throwing Jesus under the bus and saying, oh, like passing the buck, right? Like he told me to do it. It's his fault. Go after him and not me. But there's another way also. And I do think that it's kind of a funny scene, there's a lot of humor there, but um, there's another way to understand why he answers that. What's another way to understand that?
I think he's pointing the power and authority back at Jesus, like where it comes from, the
Right. Well,
source of the power.
right. Like if someone has
Mhm,
the power to transform someone into wellness,
mhm.
maybe that implies that they have the authority to say what's permissible on the Sabbath. And so while this man did not answer Jesus about whether he wanted to get well, he did demonstrate obedience. He picked up his mat and he walked. He did exactly as Jesus said, and he is like attributing his actions to obedience to Jesus. And one reason why I find that explanation compelling is um, because his answer really gets under the skin of the religious leaders, right? And that he is referring the authority to Jesus, and they think they should have the authority. And he's pointing out his obedience to Jesus, and they think that they are owed his obedience, right? And so, we see that they get very upset about it, towards the end of this passage. Well, Jesus had slipped away, and the man didn't, couldn't place him. Well, that he's gone now, um, and so Jesus finds the man in the temple. Why do you think this man is in the temple?
Maybe because he thought he should give thanks for being healed.
Yeah, I think that would be a very logical response for Jews, right? Certain diseases, we know leprosy and other skin diseases required a sacrifice upon healing, but I think, it would make sense to any Jew to offer a sacrifice or to go to the temple and give thanks after being delivered from a debilitating illness all these many years. So he may have been there sacrificing or just giving thanks. Yeah. What else?
I think it's just maybe like the desire to be connected to where people meet Jesus, like where where.
Hey, babe, I can't do it right now. I'm on a Bible study.
Oh, I
So,
don't know if you heard that, Deanna.
yeah, so
Okay.
I did hear it. It just took me a second because I was using my little host mute. Um, yeah, so it may, this is where a rabbi would be. So if he's hoping to see Jesus again, maybe he goes, I hadn't really thought of that. When he goes to the temple, maybe it's like, well, if I were going to find that rabbi again, maybe I'd find him here. Yeah. Yeah. Anything else? Other ideas?
I don't think he's allowed in the temple for 38 years now.
I wonder that as well. So, um, Leviticus gives certain rules for priests not being able to serve in the temple when they have certain diseases, defects, things wrong with them, then they would not be able to serve in the temple. But in this period, it's thought that people with diseases or disabilities, it was extended to the general population so that those people would not be allowed in the temple. So it may have been that this man has gone 38 years without being able to go into the temple. And the temple is the heart of the religious life of the Jewish people there in Jerusalem. So it may be that he ran to the temple just just full of joy that he was finally able to enter again and participate in the worship life of Jerusalem. So he may, all of those things may have been part of why he was in the temple. And, we think about Jesus not only healed this man, but he restored the man's ability to come into the presence of God in their current system. And Jesus has an instruction for the man. What is it?
Don't sin anymore.
Yeah, or what? This is
Or
weird,
something
right?
worse might happen to you.
Yes. Okay, so that's a little strange. So, like, it makes us wonder if his original did he get really cocky and fall off the wall? I mean, like, what did he do that caused this implies that some way his illness was caused by his spiritual state, and we don't know how. And we know that that's not always the case, because we're going to read next week about the man born blind and those ideas about sin and its association with illness, and what Jesus says about that is different than what he says here. So we're back around to Shirley's point that Jesus knows, or at the end of the last verses of chapter 2, Jesus knows what is in a man. And Jesus encourages this man, like, you have been physically made well. Pursue spiritual transformation, pursue spiritual wellness and wholeness. That it goes together. Go ahead, Judy.
I was just going to say what came up for me was just maybe what we'll be talking about a little bit later, but just the idea that the something worse could happen to you is like a spiritual illness, like not like he's well now physically, but there's something that could be worse than that. He's been healed from that, but you don't want to have to experience, I would say, separation from God, from his side of things. Not that God isn't always near, but that our sin causes separation.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, to me, the picture of him going to the temple was like he wanted to be near the source of the power that healed him. And like he knew about that, but I think Jesus is trying to tell him here that there's a different way you need to be healed even
Yeah.
more. So if you
And that
sin, you're
that
not going to
matters.
be well. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Great point. Yeah. Well, Jesus, other comments on that before I don't want to leave that if other people have comments. Well, Jesus, he has this interaction. We see this is the conclusion of his direct interaction with this man, but the repercussions are going to go forward for Jesus through John. So, what does it say in verse 16 is the result for Jesus?
That's why the Jews were persecuting Jesus.
Persecuting him. Yeah. And this word persecuting literally means to pursue or cause to flee, right? It's a word that means like chasing someone down, but it's used metaphorically for, the kind of persecuting that like we're seeing here. It can also mean prosecuting. So to pursue someone in a court of law. And we will begin to see a Jewish prosecution of Jesus. They are charging him with breaking the law, specifically here the Sabbath, but they continue to prosecute Jesus through the rest of the book. And John doesn't, like, when we get to the Passion Week, like in Mark, there's a Jewish trial and then there's a Roman trial, right? There's like two trials in a row, each part. Well, in John, the Passion Week doesn't detail that Jewish trial. Instead, like the rest of the first half of John, Jesus is under prosecution. He is on trial for being who he is and for claiming to be who he is, right? And note the parallel in verse 18. What's the goal of their persecution and prosecution? What do they want to happen in the end?
Well, they want him dead.
Yeah, they want to kill him. Like they're taking this thing all the way, right? It is they have set their sights on putting Jesus to death. And it says it's because of two things, the Sabbath, but what else? What else?
Making himself equal with God.
Yeah. Yeah, and it says he was calling God his own father. Now, the Jews, the Jewish authorities call God their father too. So they in chapter 841, they're having this discussion about parentage. They're calling him, you're the son of a Samaritan. We're the sons of Abraham, which is just a way of saying you dirty, no good dog. It's an insult. But in their discussion, they say we are sons of Abraham, and Jesus challenged them, and they say God is our father. We have one father, God. So they claim God as their father too, but Jesus is doing something more. He means something more than when they do it, right? He's making himself equal with God in the way that he's calling God his father. So let's look at that. At the end of verse 17, my father is what? What is my father doing?
Working.
On the Sabbath.
Hmm.
Now, isn't that a little weird? Right? Because I thought God rested on the Sabbath. And now Jesus saying, my father is working on the Sabbath. So what is going on? What's happening with this?
I think the healing power that he shared with the man at Bethesda, or the pool of Bethesda, um, since God the Father works through him, he knows he's doing God's work because God is working through him.
Yeah, he claims to be extending the very work of the Father. Yeah. When we first get the story of, okay, God created, and then on the seventh day, God rested. What did it mean for God rest, right? Because we ask ourselves, well, did God get tired out and he really needed a nap, or he really needed to put his feet up? Like, no, okay, that doesn't make sense. So what does it mean that God rested on the seventh day when he first created the world?
He was finished with the creation.
To be finished. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Other thoughts?
I see it as a moment of, I don't know, like as a creative maker type. I like after I make something, like I kind of pour over it in
Yeah.
stillness and in just taking it all in, what I've put my hands to, caring about it. And I'm sure like God was amazed at his own work. Like, so I just see it as like that, and a model of us to take time to look what God has made for us as well. So
Yeah. Yeah. Other comments on that? That's really neat. So
God's not done yet, I guess would be my, that's my take on it.
yes, that is,
Yeah. And, as the
and
Hebrew writer says, the seventh day still remains.
Yeah.
the God is never done.
right.
Praise God. So okay, there was so much in that that's so great. Okay, we use the word rest in a couple of different ways in English as well. So, like when the Israelites receive their inheritance rest, they come into the promised land. It doesn't mean they don't have to do anything there, right? But it's their rest because it is the completion of where they are supposed to be. And when a king is able to rest on his throne, that doesn't mean the king doesn't have jobs to do as a reigning king. It means the king has um, establish his authority and can be on his throne in peace and satisfaction. And so I think that creation analogy, or I mean, I don't even know if it's an analogy, it might be a direct comparison, right? Um, God has created the world and then rested like a king on the throne in satisfaction and delight and peace at what has been completed. And yet, when God transitions from creating the world, he transitions not to being done with it, but to reigning over it. And so, rabbis in Jesus' time agreed that God continuously sustained the world, holding it together by God's power and reigning over God's creation. And so, while sin is a destructive force in the world, God is always the protective and sustaining force in the world. And God never ceases to do this work, even on the Sabbath. And you mentioned a model for us. We can rest because we know that God is on the throne. It's God sustaining the world, not me. And so I can be humble enough to stop my work and recognize that God will continue to sustain the world. And so we get that meaning of the Sabbath here. So if that is the kind of work that the Father does on the Sabbath, what is Jesus saying about himself? What's his claim there? April, you're
He's
muted, but
claiming
I
that
see
he's
what you're
God.
saying. More of the same, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that like if Jesus is saying, I'm doing the kind of work the Father does on the Sabbath is sustaining the world, and Jesus is claiming an extension of that in his healing, this is a big claim, right? So we understand how inciting it is to the Jewish authorities. And he continues to elaborate in this next section about his father's work and how he is a continuation of it. And he also, if we were covering the next section, the last part of chapter 5, which we are not, we would see that Jesus speaks to that prosecutorial environment. It's all about his testimony and whether his testimony is valid. And your translations may say like, if I testify about myself, my testimony is not true. That doesn't mean true as opposed to false. It means valid as opposed to invalid, right? So read that as like Jesus continues to say, my testimony is valid and I'll tell you why. And he reviews the testimony of John, the testimony of the works that he is doing, the testimony of the Father through him, and the testimony of Scripture. And so it's that environment of court that really uh, prompts this whole next section of teaching. So all because of these big claims that he is making, and I think sometimes those go by us without us realizing what he's saying, but they clearly were very triggered, right? They knew what he was saying.
I think
Thoughts
we've been
or any
honked
other
off.
questions on this chapter?
Oh,
Go ahead.
I was just saying, I think we'd be pretty honked off too. I
Yeah.
mean, just thinking of myself right now and someone coming and saying, I was speaking to a Jewish friend the other day, and she was being very respectful about how we believe we have found the Messiah, and she said that's not true. And I thought that kind of honks me off. And then, and then I tried to respect her too. But yeah, that would get us, you know?
Yeah. He's pushing religious buttons, right?
Hmm.
And we
Hmm.
understand that. Yeah,
Mhm.
great point. Well, we're gonna pair this with the very first part of chapter 7, because it's really still all about this healing on the Sabbath. When we get to the end of it, we'll talk about exactly how that ties together, or it'll be obvious how it ties together. Would someone read John 7:1 through 9?
I'll read it.
Thank you.
Um, After this, Jesus went about in Galilee. He would not go about in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him. Now the Jews' feast of booths was at hand. So his brothers said to him, "Leave here and go to Judea, that your disciples also may see the works you are doing. For no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world." For not even his brothers believed in him. Jesus said to them, "My time is not yet come, but your time is always here. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify about it that its works are evil. You go up to the feast. I am not going up to the feast, for my time is not yet fully come." After saying this, he remained in Galilee.
Okay. Thank you. So, you notice this begins with after these things, or sometime later, your translation will say 5, 6, and 7 begin that same way. It's kind of a generic sort of, and then, and it tells us, like, I don't think John is really giving us like a clear geographic itinerary of Jesus here. So Jesus had been in the temple in our last section, but now he's in Galilee, right? And so he's teaching, he's in, and the synoptics spend a lot of time on Jesus' ministry in Galilee, and John just puts him there a couple of times, but he's there because the Jews are trying to kill him in Jerusalem, and yet it's a feast time that the Jews would normally go to Jerusalem for. And so that's the conflict here, is that you would normally go for the feast, but they're trying to kill him there. And so the brothers are like, "You going to go to the feast?" What do you think of their speech? What do you think of their encouragement to him? I saw an eek face.
I think they're basically saying, "Prove yourself," like, or, "I dare you," or whatever a brother would would say to another brother when they're expecting him to show up for everyone the way that they have seen him show up, and just like validify himself, I guess.
Go
Hey,
prove
good
yourself.
go-to. There's that dreamer.
Prove himself.
Okay, that was a quote about Joseph. You just talked about how Joseph's
Yeah.
brothers talked about him. And I kind of thought that too, because like the text just said, now it was his life would be endangered to go to Jerusalem. And here they are like taunting him to go to Jerusalem. So do they not know that it's dangerous? Do they not care that it's dangerous? Do they hope that it's dangerous, like Joseph's brothers? Yeah, yeah. Paige, what was your eek face? Was it that, or did you have other thoughts?
Yeah, it was just the same thing that it was like, go show everybody.
Huh.
That they were, yeah. Ooh.
Yeah, it's taunt. It seems like
Mhm.
taunting,
Mhm.
right? And it seems like they're focused on publicity, maybe, right? It's like, okay, he should be there building a following. He should be there. If he's gonna claim to be Messiah, go claim to be Messiah, right? Jesus says, "My time has not yet come." And so we really get a sense that Jesus is not going to be taunted into doing the thing it's not time for, right? And his time is at God's direction and on God's mission. And the brothers, we never hear from the brothers again in John, in the book of John, right? So we get a real sense that the brothers were not on, right. The brothers were not on mission, right? All right, so he doesn't go, but now let's see what happens. Someone read verses 10 through 20, please. Or I can get that. I think everybody may have read already. But when his brothers had gone up to the feast, then he himself also went on up, not publicly, but as if in secret. So the Jews were seeking him at the feast and were saying, "Where is he?" And there was much grumbling among the crowds concerning him. And some were saying, "He's a good man." And others were saying, "No, on the contrary, he leads people astray." Yet no one was speaking openly of him for fear of the Jews, meaning the Jewish religious authorities. But when it was now the midst of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and began to teach. And the Jews were then astonished, saying, "How has this man become so learned, having never been educated?" Meaning formal rabbinic training. So Jesus answered them and said, "My teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. If anyone is willing to do his will, he will know of the teaching, whether it is of God or whether I speak from myself. He who speaks from himself seeks his own glory, but he who is seeking the glory of the one who sent him, he is true, and there is no unrighteousness in him. Did not Moses give you the law, and yet none of you carries out the law?" Meaning, you're trying to murder me, and that's against the law, So why do you seek to kill me? And the crowd answered, "You've got a demon. Who's seeking to kill you?" Okay, let's pause there and try to figure out what's going on here, because this is interesting. So Jesus goes ahead and goes up. In what way does he go up?
Well, the go up means ascend or to rise. So it's
Yeah, and always Jerusalem is said to be up from wherever you are. So he goes up to Jerusalem,
mhm.
but he goes in secret. What do you think that means? What does it look like for him to go in secret?
Maybe just
Like
like by
Nicodemus,
himself.
Maybe by himself. So obviously not with his brothers, but maybe not with an entourage that a teacher would have. Somebody else spoke up. Who was it?
it is like Jesus, Nicodemus came to Jesus by night, so it was like secretly.
Yeah, we wondered, like, does he go at night? Does he not go with people? Andrea, what else were you going to say?
I was going to say he probably disguised himself with his hood of his thing. I'm just, I saw the Chosen series,
Yeah.
so you know,
Same.
so,
I have not seen it, but I hear very good things. And
no,
so,
it's very good. I think he probably, when they say, he goes in secret, I think he's attempting to disguise himself or hide himself.
okay, so
Either way,
rabbis would have distinctive dress. So
yeah.
even if he doesn't, he doesn't have to wear a mask. All he would have to do is not go with his disciples following him, not wear the distinctive dress of a rabbi. And, I mean, they don't have wanted posters, right? They don't have nobody's pictures on the inside of a milk carton. So how would they know who he was if he didn't dress as a rabbi? And this makes sense of these next two scenes in a way that I had not understood before. I was very puzzled. I'm like, why are they suddenly surprised by his teaching when he never got that reaction before? They say he's astonished, but they never had that reaction before. It's probably because he doesn't look like a rabbi today, right? He is not dressed like a rabbi. And his answer is funny too, right? How did this man become so educated not having gone to rabbi school. And what does Jesus say?
He
My
says,
teaching is not mine.
Yeah, it's
yes.
kind of, it's
But
almost like I went to
from God
rabbi school in heaven,
in
you know,
heaven.
like he's like, yeah, that's because it's straight from God. So yeah, so they don't know who he is. And look what they say when he says, you're trying to kill me. How do they respond to that one?
Basically said he was crazy.
Yeah, in 20. That you have a demon who's trying to kill you is you're crazy. Nobody's trying to
Mhm.
kill you, right? So they don't know who he is. They don't know that he's Jesus, right? In the way that the audience to the story does, right? We, the reader, know who he is the whole time, but we see that this crowd of people, and there's all this intrigue going on, right? People, the Jews are asking for him. They don't know which one he is. They're looking for informants, right? They're asking, but nobody's answering them because they don't want to inform on him, or they don't want to endanger themselves, or both. Like, this is already a dangerous, high stakes, high tension situation. Um, and so
Because it
Jesus
reminds me,
says, let's go ahead.
I'm sorry I interrupted. I just, ever since we read the scripture, I've been thinking of Jesus on the road to Emmaus.
Mhm.
And I'm thinking, yeah,
Yeah.
he,
Well, and
he must
somebody
have
else,
been able to, he must have been able to disguise himself pretty well.
yeah. And someone else
Um,
mentioned when Mary thinks he's the gardener.
oh, and
And,
when he
both
says,
of those are,
and she doesn't recognize him
it
until he
doesn't,
says her
yeah. So
name.
but both of those are post-resurrection. And so there is
That's true.
something to
That's
be
true.
said for the post-resurrection Jesus having different characteristics, maybe, because he walks through walls, he appears in locked rooms, and um, maybe different characteristics than the natural lifespan Jesus before his human death. And so we don't know. I think here it wouldn't take a disguise. It would just take them not realizing, because he's not dressed like a rabbi. So let's read on. Let's continue here. 21. Jesus answered them, I did one deed. So, okay, now Jesus is telling them something about themselves. And you all marvel. For this reason, okay, we're going to come back to this part, because this needs a little bit of background. For this reason, Moses is giving you circumcision, not because it is from Moses, but from the fathers. And on the Sabbath, you circumcise a man. And if a man receives circumcision on the Sabbath, so the laws of Moses will not be broken. Are you angry with me? Because, okay, here's the reveal. I made an entire man well on the Sabbath. Do not judge according to appearance. So maybe Jesus doesn't look like a rabbi just now, but judge with righteous judgment. So now he has said, I made an entire man well on the Sabbath. So they're going, oh, you're that guy, the pool of Bethesda thing, right? So verse 25, some of the people were Jerusalem are saying, oh, is this not the man they're seeking to kill? Now he's not crazy. Now they don't say no one's trying to kill you. Now they say, oh, this is the one that healed on the Sabbath, and they're trying to kill him. Look, he's speaking publicly, and they're saying nothing to him. The rulers do not really know this is the Christ, do they? And so Jesus's actions now bring about the question of Jesus' identity, right? Now that they know he's the one, right? He is the one who healed the paralytic, maybe doesn't say, the invalid of 38 years on the Sabbath. Now they say, ah, this is the guy they're trying to kill. So Jesus has revealed himself, and that brings about the question of who is he? If he is the one who did this thing, then is he the Messiah? Let's look at the other part of 21 through 24, and then we'll see if there are any extra questions. Okay. Or the 22 through and 23. Okay. So Jesus says, Moses gave you circumcision, and then he qualifies, well, Abraham started it, but we're calling it Moses because it's part of the law of Moses. You circumcised on the Sabbath, so shouldn't I heal on the Sabbath? What is going on there with that logic?
Is it that the law is to fulfill God's will, or the keeping of what is supposed to be righteous, or and Jesus is saying, if I am from God, if I am God, then shouldn't I be able to heal on the Sabbath?
Doing the work of God. Yeah, there's a
Doing the work of
continuation.
God. Right.
So there's some background here that I think is helpful. So the rabbi said, oh, God is always doing the work of sustaining the world, even on the Sabbath. In addition, people are born and people die on the Sabbath. You might wish to put it off till the next day, but you can't, right? People are born and people die. So God does the work of life and of death on the Sabbath, and that principle can govern our behavior as well. So rabbis permitted the saving of a life on the Sabbath. And in the Synoptics, Jesus mentions this, like if anyone has an ox who falls in the pit on the Sabbath, wouldn't you save him? Right? So they would say, oh, you can always save a life on the Sabbath, but anything else, anything that wasn't life or death, they would say, no, you must put it off until another day, except circumcision. And the reason circumcision was the exception, the baby is supposed to be circumcised the eighth day. Well, what if the eighth day falls on the Sabbath? Well, the rabbi said to circumcise a child is to perfect the child. It was the completion, or the bringing of the child into who he was supposed to be. It was the nature of circumcision according to their logic. And so you would even circumcise on the Sabbath because it was the perfecting of a man. And so when Jesus is drawing on these two things and pulling them together and taking the authority to do so, right? So he says, if you circumcise to perfect the man, how about me making a man whole, making a man well? And also, if God does the work of life and death, my healing is the work of bringing life on the Sabbath. And so it is really a claiming of the authority of God in his work. Jesus' work is God's work. He claims it much more than the way the rabbis were willing to claim and interpret, right? So that explains why the conversation immediately goes like, "Oh, do they think he really is the Christ? Do they already know it?" And so it's all about who is Jesus. Questions or comments on that section? Well, the people claim, like, they you see in verse 27, they say, well, except we know where this man is from, meaning, I think, he lived in Capernaum. He grew up in Nazareth. In Nazareth. But whenever the Christ may come, no one knows where he is from. This is an idea that comes from two apocryphal books. First Enoch and Fourth Ezra have the idea that the Christ origins will be mysterious. And Jesus uses this opportunity to tell them, the most important thing about me. I'm telling you the most important thing about me. Verse 28, Jesus cried out in the temple, teaching and saying, "You both know me and know where I am from. I have not come from myself. He who sent me is true, whom you do not know. I know him because I am from him, and he sent me." So Jesus says the most important thing to know is that I'm from God. And the reason you don't know it is because you don't know God. So they were seeking to seize him, right? This made them mad again, right? But no man laid his hand on him because his hour had not yet come, but many of the crowd believed in him. Okay, so Jesus says, "You do know me. What you know is I am from God. I'm of God, and I'm seeking." If we look back at verse 16 through 17, this is actually verse 18. "I'm seeking the glory of the one who sent me." Jesus is saying, I am seeking God's glory. I am from God. I am doing the work of God. And when Jesus talks about glorifying God or seeking the glory of God, that glory is the weight of the truth of God's nature, who God is. And when Jesus glorifies God, he's showing who God is in God's goodness, right? Jesus is never off mission here, right? He's never on a publicity trip, as his brothers would have him go on. He's never going at the wrong time. He goes in secret and teaches anonymously. No one knows who he is until he tells them, "I did this work of healing. It's my Father's work. It shows who I am to show who God is." Healing, bringing wholeness, restoring ability to be with God. So all of that kind of comes together, and some of the crowd believes in him. Thoughts on this passage?
If there's time at the end, I have a question
Okay.
about early chapter 7 about the booths, the Feast of the Booths, but that's an aside.
Well, go ahead.
Now, I just wondered if there was any significance about the timing of that or the length of that, or that Jesus, so it's 8 days long, and I know the significance of the feast, but like the fact that it was 8 days long and it was on the fourth day when he started teaching. Is there any significance to any of those types of things?
Mine just says the midst of the feast. Yours says the fourth day. That's interesting.
Well, I just wondered if the midst of the feast was 8 days long.
Mm.
So I just wondered if it meant that that was the middle of the whole week, or it was.
So I think there's 4 Jewish feasts here. The Sabbath is kind of the first, and then in chapter 6 we have the Passover mentioned, and then here in 7 we have the Feast of Booths or Feast of Tabernacles, and then in 10 we have Hanukkah or the Feast of Dedication. So this whole section, and it will continue through 8. The very end of 8 is the end of this temple discourse, and the Feast of Booths was a period where they would build these shelters, because in the desert they lived, in the wilderness they lived in tents and shelters, but also this is held like in October, and there would be shelters in the field for bringing in. So it's the time of year, it's not grain harvest, it's like olives harvest, and that's a very valuable crop. And they would have these shelters in the field in order to watch over the crops as they're bringing them in, because they're worth money. And so it's like the booths or tents or tabernacles sort of fit that history of the of the Exodus, and then also the agricultural period that it fell into. And it was a time where they would have a festival focused on light and on the pouring of water. They had these rituals of light and rituals of pouring of water, and those both show up later in the chapter. And it's not the part we did, but you see in verse 12 of chapter 8. Now Jesus spoke to them saying, I am the light of the world. And so the light is part of the giant lampstands in the temple that would be lit and would, October, the days are getting shorter. It's the coming of winter. Now, I haven't noticed, it's October here and I don't have any winter coming yet. And I'm kind of disgruntled about it. It's a little, but this would be like the time where the days getting so light, and then they had the desire for rain to come after the summers are dry there, and so there would be a water pouring out thing, and so both of those come in later in the chapter. And so booths is like said at the beginning, and then that doesn't get completed. It doesn't get sort of culminated until later.
Okay.
Andrew, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was gonna focus on the fact that during this discourse in the temple, where he is repeating himself over and over again, I am, I am. It's fascinating. The whole book of John is, moving forward, as you know, it is just his continuously saying over and over and over again, and they cannot, of course, there are those that do believe in him, and it states that in this week's reading too. But just in John, it just amazes me how, okay, it amazes me because it's the same way today. You preach the word, share the gospel, and you say it over and over and over again. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the light. And I don't know, people, it just goes right through them, or they accept him, and that's what's happening here at this part of John.
Well, and the words are simple, but the ideas are not. This is, I am the light of the world. These are short words, but what does it mean? What is it to be doing the work of the Father, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, I feel like, yeah, but I keep feeling like I need another layer to soak in. There's always another layer to soak in.
Mm-hmm.
There's so much there. It's so simple and yet it's so deep. Yeah.
It is deep, and it's like the story last week that we studied about the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman at the well. But she got it right away. I mean, he said the simple words, and he said to her, blah blah blah, and that wasn't very nice of me to say, but he said the words to her over and over again, like, I'm that guy, I'm the one you're talking about. And she believed it and went off and brought the others in. But then you get to the Jews. Now, this was a Samaritan, and you get to the Jewish, religious authorities, and they're just like, you're nuts. You're nuts.
Maybe sometimes when we think we have so much of ourselves, it feels like we have too much to lose to really take the good that's offered in Jesus. So, and I think, the Jews felt like they had their own thing going. Oh yeah, that's a lesson, I think, for me, for us. Other thoughts?
I like it again because in the one with the pool of the Bethesda, Jesus said again, my time has not come. The woman of the well, when they were having the wine, turn the water into wine, my time has not come. He reminds people several times over and over again, my time has not come.
He
Mhm.
has a plan. Yep. Yep. He's determined to stay on it. Well, I'll wrap us up here because I know we've gone over a little bit in time, but just this idea, I have been very blessed by this idea of the good news that God is constantly holding the world together because, you know, it feels like our world is falling apart sometimes, doesn't it? You know, we really do feel that. And that's because, um, that is the nature of the world as it exists with sin and death on the loose. It's the nature of our world to corrode and to decay and to constantly try to fall apart. And it's only the work of God constantly holding it together. And God never stops working because God is true and God is good. And Jesus came to do that very same work and to do it for you and for me. And so when we feel like we are constantly falling apart and we need help to be made whole again, to come together again, to be brought back into the presence of God, Jesus is there, never stopping work. And we need to be made well. And Jesus does that for us, makes us whole, restores us into the presence of God. And so this man is healed at the house of Hesed, that house of mercy, the covenant faithfulness of God. And that very mercy comes to you and me as well through the work of Jesus. So thank you so much for being here tonight. Thanks for your great discussion. Next week, we will study Jesus healing the man born blind. So another super interesting passage. Read chapters 9 and 10 to prepare for that lesson. Thanks, everybody.